She wasn't looking for someone to save her. He wasn't looking either. They found each other anyway. A sci-fi romance. Mira Solen did not believe in rescue. She had grown up on a mining barge where rescue was a word people used in prayers, not in plans. You fixed your own hull breaches. You rationed your own oxygen. You did not wait for someone else to open the airlock because by the time they got there you were already gone. So when the Kestrel wake, her ship, her responsibility, her mistake, took a micrometeor through the port coolant line at 0.3 relative velocity, she did not send a distress call. She put on her suit, crawled into the freezing dark of the service corridor and started welding. That was where Threll found her, not because he was looking, because he was lost. Threll Vascameron had been drifting for 6 days when his scanner caught the faint thermal bloom of a human welding torch against the cold hull of a ship he did not recognize. In a debris field he had not meant to enter. He was ashen, tall in the way his people were tall, built long and spare for gravity wells lighter than Earth's, skin the color of wet slate, 3 fingers and a thumb on each hand that moved with a precision human engineers spent their whole careers trying to replicate in prosthetics. He had been a cartographer. Now he was a man whose ship's navigation core had failed somewhere past the edge of mapped space, whose crew had taken the last working lifeboat 11 hours before he woke up, and who had been alone long enough that he had stopped talking to himself, because the silence that followed his own voice was worse than the silence before it. He did not board the Kestrel wake to be a hero. He boarded it because his suit had 4 hours of air left and hers had a working airlock. She did not let him in because she trusted him. She let him in because the alternative was watching a stranger suffocate 11 meters from her window. And she had decided a long time ago that she would rather live with her mistakes than with that. The first thing Threll said to her, through the translator patch stuck awkwardly to his throat, was, "Your coolant line is welded wrong." Mira, still in her suit, still furious at the universe in general, stared at him. "Excuse me. The bead is uneven. It will hold for perhaps 4 days, then it will not." He said this the way another person might comment on the weather, not cruel, not proud, simply accurate. "I can fix it properly. I was an engineer before I was a cartographer. Everyone on a survey ship learns to fix things because nothing that far out gets fixed twice." She looked at him for a long moment. 6 days of drift showed on him, the slate-gray skin gone a shade paler around the eyes, the careful stillness of someone rationing his own movements the way she'd been rationing air. "Fine," she said. "Fix it. Then explain what the hell you are and why you're in my debris field." "It is not your debris field," he said, "but I take your point." A pause. "I do not know what I am to you, I know what I am to myself." A man very far from a home he is not certain still exists. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. She hated how much she liked it. They did not fall in love in the first week. That would have been convenient, and neither of them was built for convenient. What happened in the first week was smaller and stranger. He fixed the coolant line, properly this time, 3 passes with a torch calibrated for metals his hands had never touched before, muttering measurements to himself in a language the translator patch didn't bother to render because it recognized them as numbers, not words. She watched him work and found herself doing something she almost never did, staying quiet because he clearly did his best thinking with his hands and no interruptions. In exchange, she taught him her ship. Not out of trust, she told herself that several times, but because a man who understood her systems was a man who could keep her alive if the coolant line failed anyway, 4 days or 40. He learned fast. Faster than any human tech she'd worked with. He asked questions that made her rethink things she'd assumed were settled a decade ago. "Why do you route backup power through the crew quarters?" he asked on day 4, instead of directly to the reactor housing. "Because if the reactor housing floods with backup power and something's already wrong with it, I want the fire in my living room, not in the room with the reactor." He was quiet for a moment. "That is either the most reckless design principle I have ever heard, or the most honest one." "Can it be both?" Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile. Ashen faces didn't work that way, but something adjacent to it, a loosening around the eyes. "It can," he said. "I think most good things are." She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a coastline by walking it rather than by looking at a map. He had left 3 moons and a research post behind to take the cartography posting because staying still, he said, had started to feel like drowning very slowly. He had a sister who sent him messages in a compressed data format that took 4 days to decompress properly, and he read them anyway, every time, because 4-day-old love was still love. He did not know if his crew had survived the escape. He carried that not knowing the way she carried the memory of the barge quietly and always. He learned things about her too. That she flew alone not because she liked being alone, but because the one time she hadn't, she'd lost someone. And grief had taught her a lesson about proximity that she'd never quite managed to unlearn. That she talked to her ship out loud when she thought no one was listening. That underneath the person who welded hull breaches with her jaw set and her hands steady, there was someone who still, 20 years later, flinched at the sound of a hull groaning under pressure. Because the barge had made that sound for 11 minutes before it depressurized. And 11 minutes was a very long time to know something was coming. He did not try to fix that in her. He simply, on the nights the ship groaned in the cold, sat near her without asking permission and without saying anything until the sound stopped meaning what it used to mean. Aye. They found the source of his lost lifeboat's beacon on day 12. Faint, intermittent. 4 days burn away on a heading that would take the Kestrel wake well outside the range Mira had planned to fly. She did not hesitate as long as she expected to. That's a real detour, she said, mostly to herself, already recalculating the burn. It is, he agreed. You do not have to take it. I know I don't. Well, then why? Because you'd take it for me. She didn't look up from the console. You fixed a coolant weld you had no reason to fix properly for a stranger on a ship that wasn't yours in a system that wasn't yours either. I'm not going to be the person who does less than that. He was quiet for a while. When he spoke again, his voice had a texture she hadn't heard from him before, something unguarded. On my homeworld we have a word. It does not translate cleanly for a debt that is not owed but is paid anyway, because refusing to pay it would cost you something in yourself. I think you are describing that. Maybe, she said. Or maybe I just like having you on my ship, and I'm not ready for that to end at the first working lifeboat we find. She hadn't meant to say the second half out loud. She felt it land in the small cabin like something dropped from a height. Threll didn't fill the silence with reassurance, and she was grateful for that reassurance would have felt like being handled. He simply said after a moment, I am not ready for that either. They found the lifeboat on day 15. Empty. Its beacon still transmitting on automatic, its crew compartment stripped of everything except the emergency rations and a single data drive wedged behind a panel, clearly hidden rather than lost. Threll's hands were not steady when he opened the drive's contents on the Kestrel Wake's console. Mira stood behind him, close enough to be a presence, far enough to give him room. The message was from his first officer, recorded 8 days prior. His crew had made it to a relay station 2 systems over. They were alive. They had left the beacon transmitting and the drive hidden in case anyone came looking, in case he came looking on the chance, small, they admitted, but real, that he'd survived the navigation core failure at all. Threll sat very still for a long time after the message ended, long enough that Mira almost said something. She didn't. She had learned in 15 days that some silences were not meant to be filled. They are alive, he finally said, and his voice cracked in a way that had nothing to do with the translator patch. They are, she said, and so are you. He turned to look at her then, really look. The way people look at each other when a piece of grief has just been lifted off them and they're recalibrating to a lighter weight. I did not think I would be 12 days ago. I had made peace with a version of the ending that did not include this. Which part, she asked, being alive or she didn't finish it? Both, he said. Neither was something I let myself want. Wanting things that far out alone, it felt like a luxury I could not afford. I know that feeling, she said. I've been affording it for 20 years by not having it. And now, she thought about the barge, and the 11 minutes and the decade of flying alone because alone was a system she understood and grief was not. She thought about a man who fixed her coolant line properly instead of just well enough, who sat near her without being asked, who had learned her reckless honest ship and not once suggested she rebuild it into something safer. Now, she said, I think I might be affording it again. They did not fly to the relay station immediately. There was a course to plot, repairs to finish, a debris field's worth of danger still between the Kestrel wake and open space. But there was no more urgency in the silences between them, only the particular ease of 2 people who had stopped bracing for the other to leave. On the last night before they'd reached clear space, Mira sat in the cockpit with the lights down, watching the debris field slide past the same field that had almost killed her, that had brought him to her airlock at the exact hour his air ran thin. Threll found her there the way he found her most nights now and sat down without asking. I used to think, she said without looking at him, that needing someone was the same as being weak. That the barge taught me. Fix your own breaches, don't wait for the airlock. And now I think maybe I just hadn't met anyone worth waiting for an airlock with. She glanced at him. You didn't come here to save me. You came here because your air was running out. That is true, and I didn't let you in because I trusted you. I let you in because I couldn't watch you die 11 meters from my window. Also true. So neither of us was looking for this. He considered that the debris field throwing thin light across the planes of his face. No, he agreed, neither of us was looking. I think that may be why it worked. We were not looking for rescue. We were only looking for someone to be honest with in the dark. The rest happened on its own, the way good welds hold, not because you forced them, but because you did the work correctly and then let them set. She laughed, a real laugh, the first one in longer than she wanted to count. That's a terrible metaphor. It is an engineer's metaphor. I did warn you I was one before I was a cartographer. Terrible, she said again, and reached for his hand, 3 fingers and a thumb curling careful and certain around hers. But I think I'm keeping it anyway. Outside, the debris field thinned toward open space. And somewhere ahead of them, a relay station waited with the rest of a crew who thought they might be grieving a man who was, instead, quietly and unexpectedly, no longer alone. Neither of them had gone looking. But they had found each other in the coldest stretch of the dark and decided separately and then together that they were not letting go. Letting go.